Hi, this is Shane Davis. It was at the turn of the century when I visited George Sawchuk. George Sawchuk lived in Fanny Bay on Vancouver Island. George was an artist, but he was also referred to as the artist in the woods, or the crazy artist in the woods. He was born in Ontario in 1927 or 1929. He died in 2012. Certainly George's ideas were not mainstream. His ideas emanated from his cultural background of Russian socialism and Catholicism taught during his schooling. George rejected formal education in his teenage years, so went to work with a construction crew. It was then when he lost one of his legs due to amputation. With this loss, he was able to pursue an artistic-oriented existence. Our walk through the woods began at the bus stop. It is here where we must leave our preconceptions of creativity securely tied in our suitcase and begin a walk in George's forest, or as some would call it, the wacky woods. We must begin our walk with an open mind. George Sawchuk studied notable artistic persons such as Marcel Duchamp, who was associated with conceptual art, Cubism, and the Dada movement. These concepts were developing in the early decades of the 20th century and now continue into the 21st century. Another major influence on George is transcendentalist Henry Thoreau. Thoreau wrote the book entitled Walden, which described simple living in natural surroundings. In Fanny Bay, George has done just that in his wooded acreage close to the sea. It is a delight to take a walk through George's woods and to become aware of his works, sometimes displayed in unexpected places such as high up in the trees. If nothing else, one is encouraged to look before and after, plus upwards and sidewards. But there is more to George's sculptures. There are his assemblages, but he has developed his own style or character which is evident in the heads and faces, reminiscent of our own native Indian carvings and also in the monoliths of Easter Island. The type of creativity which occupies George's time is an extension of Dada or Neo-Dada. Dadaism became popular in the early 1900s and has developed intermittently into the present day. Dadaists combine familiar objects into assemblages to give them new meaning and create something unique and thought-provoking. Colored spheres were prominently displayed in many settings, but none so notable as this red-colored ball. One striking piece in the Forest Gallery is the red ball held in a black hand. The red ball symbolizes communism associated with Nelson Mandela's ANC party. The black hand symbolizes the Negro peoples of Africa. George's mother was Polish, his father Russian. George had a very deep interest in books, which was sparked at an early age. His education was the Bible and Das Kapital. He attended Catholic school during the week and Russian school on Saturdays. So George struggled with these two opposing philosophies, thus creating his many and often puzzling works of art. Throughout his forest, George has inscribed many words on wood surfaces. Not just words of wisdom or words of humor, but words to provoke thought. Not only is George Sawchuk a creative artist, but he is also an author. Living in a forest, his bookcases are the living trees, or perhaps his assemblages. Each book, though short, contains a specific message. In this assemblage, it is up to the viewer to connect the multiple components to understand George's intentions or reflect upon his own experiences. George intended his works to include or expand the viewer's experiences. This book, entitled Truth, is bolted shut. The book is intended to store vast amounts of knowledge. Truth must never be altered. In this sculpture, we have lion bookends defending the written word, which is to say, another method of defending truth. Walking through the forest gallery, written messages appear. Simple messages they may be, but they are quite humorous as well as thought-provoking. I've just stepped out to look for myself. If I return before I get back, please keep me here until I show up. Culture is something magical. If you try to make a commodity of it, it will cease to fill its role of elucidation and civilization. Joe, a Citizen, 1955 to 1988. The water rot his guts, the air rot his lungs. Is this then the price that you and I must pay to support other people's greed? Yes, my friend, you are free, free without a doubt. If you do not have the price of a meal, you are free to go without. The lullabies that closed their eyes was sung by the Gatling gun. November 16, 1885. All of the next great wars will be fought for the rights to water. Amen. The exporters of water prostitute not only their own soul, they are also prostituting the very soul and birthright of our nation. As we can see, George was extremely concerned about water. If it is sold, eventually we will be left with nothing. In his forest, George has placed his found objects, such as taps and faucets, in unusual settings. Although each one is fairly commonplace, each one is surprising and thought-provoking. With George's background in religion and communism, George's connection to nature, to the forest, and to water, he said, and I quote, "There is no need to consecrate the water, for it already arrives that way." While walking through the forest gallery, a multitude of found objects are on display. Just as similar trees are not all in one spot, so the various objects are not grouped in their theme or interpretation. However, for the purposes of illustration here, they are often grouped together. In this fallen tree there is a mirror. Although the tree appears dead, it can still reflect on the changing forest beyond. On the front cover of some of George's wooden books is a unique symbol. George said he put it there because people thought we had some kind of cult here in the woods. Thus, the mystique of the crazy artist in the woods was enhanced. As we can see, George's religious background was often reflected in his creations. Open to the viewer's interpretations, explanations will vary. From this barbed crown to the cross acting as a balance, there is a question as to whether destiny will send the believer up or down, or perhaps the wrong way. Are all things sacred? Just ask the Creator. George Sawchuk, that is. These boots were worn by the Creator. But who then drank the gin? My interpretation of this log round and padlock is that local history is kept within the growth rings. This assemblage is combined in a living fir tree. It will take a fair amount of examination to discover its complete intention. In this tree, there is an electric switch to turn on a dark rather than a light. Within this tree trunk, time stands still. It would take days, perhaps years, to see all George's creations and to understand their meaning. But that is part of the charm of Neo-Dadaism. However, other assemblages are very specific as to their meaning. Another theme through the Forest Gallery is fish. Again, interpretation is the viewpoint of the observer. Whether there are differing species of flying fish or tree-bound fish, they will be caught, captured, prepared, eaten. Ultimately, they have been lured by the cross and then crucified for all to contemplate and fear. Many of George Sawchuk's creations are the manifestations of his ideas from years gone by. For example, his giant metal arrows penetrating trees were sketched earlier, many years before he moved from North Vancouver to his forest gallery here in Fanny Bay. Throughout the forest gallery, George has placed many colored stones. The various colors attracted one's attention, and for George, the stones themselves represented knowledge held by time. Some stones were openly displayed as singles, some in combination with other stones. Some were displayed within log ends. Others were modified to accentuate their individuality. There is a home for a stone. Artistic groupings automatically gave cause to contemplate. Is this figure a stone head, or does it hold the knowledge of time? Does this spur gear have industrial links to knowledge, or is it chained to mechanical history? And of course, George reveals the method of getting blood from a stone. Actually, with these creations, there are often many interpretations, all of which hold some validity. In this small chapel emblazoned with a cross is a money-making cash register entitled The Company Store. Here is a tree where a bird can live free, both mentally and physically. However, as we wander through the forest gallery, or, as some call it, the wacky woods, there are countless images portrayed. Whether it be mechanical like this broken gearbox, or a kitchen cupboard carved into a tree trunk, it is fun to imagine what George Sawchuk had intended. It is fun to imagine what each of us interprets in his displays. Perhaps it is appropriate at this time to say that my visit to see George Sawchuk was unannounced. I had often heard of the artist in the woods. After finding the forest gallery and heading into the woods, George approached me and invited me to see his creations. I readily accepted, and thus began my exploration. I had not realized that George had become so famous for his artistic endeavors, not only in Fanny Bay or Vancouver, but his reputation was reaching into other art centers around the world. With my artistic background and curiosity, I was attracted by the many disciplines in creativity, both visual and musical. Through the years, George Sawchuk and his wife Pat have been noted for their welcoming into their lives. I immediately felt at home with them. George was happy to have me video his forest gallery, and then he invited me into his workshop. It was here that he described a few of his works.
Put in the shed there with an apple, and I call it the consummation of the marriage of Adam and Eve. And this lady named Pat Steele, she come by, and her husband's kind of religious. So all of a sudden, she looked at this piece and her face went totally red. And I said, what's the matter, Pat? She's having a heart attack. She says, you know, George, I feel like a fool. She said, all my life, I was taught the forbidden fruit was an apple. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me what it was. And her husband was there, and she got mad at him. She don't normally swear, but she swore at him. And says, you're the religious guy, and you all these years married for 35 years, and you let me believe it was an apple, you know? He said, well, it wasn't exactly an apple. He says it was a tree of knowledge, and I figured, what's the tree of knowledge? Why were they forbidden to partake of the tree of knowledge? I mean, you know. So anyway, a year or so later, I had a show in Vancouver there at the Western Front. So Art Perry, who teaches at the Emily Carr School of Art, asked me if I would lecture to his students. So I said, sure. So he brought his students up, and they looked at everything, and then I related the story about Pat Steele and the apple. So after I lectured, they all left except these two ladies. They stayed behind. So then we're all alone in the gallery. She says, oh, I'm Mrs. Steele, George. I'm very glad to mention this is my friend, Mrs. Steele. And I'm not so quick on the uptake, you know. So I think something's funny here. So then all of a sudden it dawned on me. Oh, okay, fine. They related the story because they too thought it was an apple. The forbidden fruit was an apple. So they thanked me very much. They said, now we can go to our graves knowing the truth, you know. And they're so pleased, you know. I had this in a show in Courtney one time at the gallery there. And this lady from Australia, one of the Aborigines come. And she liked this piece very much, so she wanted to meet the artist. So they brought her down here. So I said, what is it about this piece that you like? She says, well, we and Aborigines in Australia, we're still in the Stone Age, so to speak. But they treat us that way. And technology is getting so far ahead that we'll never catch up. We get going behind all the time. So it's time to shut technology down and let us catch up a little bit, you know? Oh, I got this little, I don't know where it comes from, acetylene tank or whatever the heck. And that's not a diving helmet, the diving tank. So I put this tail on it. Then I mounted on this gadget I found years and years ago. It pivots a bit, you know?
Yeah.
And so I painted yellow, and I call that 6845. Like the 6th day of the 8th month, August 1945, Hiroshima, when the Americans dropped the bomb.
Right.
Like you see in the mirror there. But you make a promised land, you have to make your own. You don't follow some guy for 40 years in the bloody deserts, you know. They come across, they call them tar sands. They shun them, you know.
Mm-hmm.
That was the devil. That was the work of the devil. All that oil boiling up the surface, you know.
What is the one with the Coke bottle?
That's the real thing now. That's the communion, eh? Coke is the real thing now. You don't get bread and wine anymore now. You get bread and Coke. The shows, I was in the first 3 tonight. I bowed out after that. And opening night, this kid come along and took the stone and broke the glass. And all the wheat and the rice poured out on the floor and broken glass. So I wasn't there at the time. My wife seen it happen. So I come back out of broom and I was sweeping up the wheat and the rice up against the butt. So the security guards come huffing and puffing. I said, you get the kid that broke the glass? He said, no, if we ever do, he's in trouble. I said, no, my friend. You bring him to me and I buy him the biggest bottle of wine in the liquor store. They said, what the hell are you talking about? I said, that's my sculpture. And unbeknown to the kid, he just completed it. Because my philosophy on food is, no one has the monopoly on food. Food belongs to everyone. So he broke the glass and he just freed the food up, you know.
George comments on this broken guitar.
Somebody hits somebody over the head with it.
Within this amazing workshop are many handcrafted items. Are they works of art? Are they works of a craftsman? Or are they works of labor? Perhaps they are works of a Dadaist. A friend of George's gave him this frame.
So he gave it to me, so I put a piece of tin behind it and painted that apple tree.
After speaking with George in his workshop, I joined George and Pat for tea and cookies. a welcome ritual which they provide for many of their unexpected visitors. Throughout my life, I have met with many artists and sculptors. After meeting with George Sawchuk, it became more clear to me regarding his perception of the world and more clear as to his motivations as to what shapes his creations. His protests to society are evident by his very lifestyle. He balanced his religious background with his social beliefs. He balanced capitalism with communism. He created for his own pleasure, often making profound social statements. In doing so, George Sawchuk was not only a Dadaist, but a truly inventive creator. George was an artist.